The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Judge Harold Thompson, a stern man in his late 50s with a reputation for being harsh, leaned back in his leather chair and smirked. His eyes locked onto the elderly woman standing before him. She was small, frail-looking, with silver hair tied neatly in a bun. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a stack of papers. To everyone in the room, she looked like just another confused senior citizen who had wandered into the wrong place. "Ma'am," Judge Thompson began, his voice dripping with mockery, "are you sure you're in the right courtroom? This isn't bingo night." A few people in the gallery chuckled nervously, but most shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The woman didn't flinch. She adjusted her glasses and looked up at him with calm, piercing eyes. "Your Honor," she said in a soft but steady voice, "I am exactly where I need to be." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "And what exactly are you here for? To file a complaint about your neighbor's noisy dog? Or maybe you lost your knitting club dues?" The gallery erupted in laughter this time, but the woman remained unfazed. She took a deep breath and said, "I'm here to represent the defendant, Your Honor." The room fell silent again. Judge Thompson's smirk faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. He glanced at the young man sitting at the defendant's table, a 22-year-old named Jake Miller, who was facing serious charges of corporate fraud. Jake looked just as shocked as everyone else. He had expected a high-powered attorney, not this elderly woman who looked like she could barely lift her briefcase. "You're his lawyer?" the judge asked, his tone now laced with skepticism. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied calmly. "My name is Eleanor Grayson." The name didn't ring a bell for Judge Thompson, but somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a seasoned court reporter dropped his pen. His eyes widened as he whispered to the person next to him, "Eleanor Grayson? As in the Eleanor Grayson?" Before anyone could react, Judge Thompson leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Well, Miss Grayson, let's see if you can keep up. This is a high-stakes case, not a tea party. I hope you're prepared." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Oh, I'm more than prepared, Your Honor." The judge rolled his eyes and motioned for the trial to begin. The prosecutor, a confident man in his 40s named Daniel Carter, stood up and began his opening statement. He laid out the case against Jake Miller with precision, painting him as a greedy young man who had stolen millions from his employer. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and the gallery murmured in agreement. When it was Eleanor's turn, she slowly rose to her feet. Everyone expected her to fumble, to struggle with the legal jargon, to crumble under the pressure. But what happened next left the entire courtroom in stunned silence. Eleanor Grayson didn't just deliver an opening statement, she delivered a masterpiece. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of authority. She dismantled the prosecution's case piece by piece, pointing out flaws in the evidence and raising questions that no one had thought to ask. Her words were sharp, her logic flawless. By the time she finished, even Judge Thompson was leaning forward, his earlier smirk replaced by a look of intense focus. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, looked visibly shaken. He had expected an easy win, but now he was facing a legal legend he hadn't even recognized. As Eleanor sat down, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Who was this woman? How had she managed to outmaneuver one of the city's top prosecutors? And why had no one recognized her name? Judge Thompson cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "Well, Ms. Grayson, it seems you've got everyone's attention. Let's see if you can keep it." But before the trial could continue, a loud crash echoed through the courtroom. The doors flew open, and a group of armed federal agents stormed in, their guns drawn. Everyone froze. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Thompson demanded, his face red with anger. One of the agents stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. "We're here for Eleanor Grayson," he said firmly. The elderly woman stood up slowly, her expression calm but unreadable. The room erupted into chaos as the agents moved toward her. Jake Miller looked terrified, unsure of what was happening. Judge Thompson banged his gavel, but no one was listening. As the agents reached Eleanor, she turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, it seems we'll have to continue this another time." And with that, she was escorted out of the courtroom, leaving everyone in shock. What had just happened? Who was Eleanor Grayson, really? And why were federal agents taking her away? The trial was far from over, but one thing was clear: nothing about this case was going to be simple. The courtroom was in complete disarray. People were shouting, reporters were scrambling to capture the scene, and Judge Thompson's gavel echoed like thunder as he tried to restore order. Jake Miller, the young defendant, sat frozen at his table, his mind racing. He had no idea what was happening. One moment, his new lawyer, an elderly woman he'd never met before, was dismantling the prosecution's case with the skill of a seasoned attorney. The next, federal agents were storming in and taking her away. Order! Order in the court! Judge Thompson bellowed, his face red with frustration. The gallery slowly quieted down, but the tension in the room was palpable. The judge turned to the prosecutor, Daniel Carter, who looked just as confused as everyone else. "Mr. Carter, do you have any idea what's going on here?" the judge demanded. Carter shook his head. "No, Your Honor. This is as much a shock to me as it is to everyone else." Judge Thompson sighed and rubbed his temples. "We'll take a recess. I want answers, and I want them now." As the judge stood and left the bench, the courtroom erupted into chatter once again. Jake Miller was quickly escorted out by bailiffs, his mind spinning. Who was Eleanor Grayson? Why had she been taken away? And what did this mean for his case? Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Eleanor Grayson was being led to a black SUV by the federal agents. Reporters swarmed the scene, shouting questions, but Eleanor remained calm and composed. Just before she was placed into the vehicle, she turned to one of the agents and said, "I assume this is about the Blackwell case?" The agent's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't respond. He simply nodded and closed the door behind her. Back inside the courthouse, Judge Thompson was in his chambers, pacing back and forth. His clerk, a young woman named Lisa, was frantically searching the internet for any information on Eleanor Grayson. "Your Honor, I think I found something," Lisa said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Well, don't keep me waiting." "What is it?" the judge snapped. Lisa turned her laptop around to show him the screen. It was an old newspaper article from over 30 years ago. The headline read, "Eleanor Grayson, the attorney who took down the mob." Judge Thompson's eyes widened as he read the article. Eleanor Grayson had been one of the most brilliant attorneys of her time, known for her fearless pursuit of justice. She had successfully prosecuted some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, including members of the infamous Blackwell crime family. But after a high-profile case that ended in tragedy, she had disappeared from the public eye, never to be seen again, until now. "This can't be the same woman," the judge muttered, though deep down, he knew it was. Meanwhile, Jake Miller was sitting in a small holding room, his head in his hands. He had been so hopeful when Eleanor Grayson had stepped in to defend him. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like he had a chance. But now, with her gone, he was back to feeling hopeless. The door opened, and a bailiff stepped in. "You've got a visitor," he said. Jake looked up, expecting to see his public defender. Instead, a tall, well-dressed man walked in. He had sharp features and an air of authority that made Jake sit up straight. "Who are you?" Jake asked nervously. The man smiled slightly. "My name is Marcus Blackwell. I'm here to help you." Jake's blood ran cold. Blackwell. The name was familiar, too familiar. It was the same name from the article about Eleanor Grayson. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "I want to make sure you don't make the same mistake Eleanor Grayson did. She thought she could take down my family. She was wrong. And now, she's going to pay for it." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to say or do. He was just a young man caught up in something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. As Marcus stood to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Jake. "Oh, and one more thing. If you value your life, you'll stay out of this. Let the adults handle it." With that, he was gone, leaving Jake alone and terrified. Back in the courthouse, Judge Thompson was still trying to piece together what had happened. He had just picked up the phone to call the FBI when his clerk burst into the room, her face pale. "Your Honor, you need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. On the screen was a breaking news alert: former attorney Eleanor Grayson arrested in connection to decades-old mob case. Judge Thompson's stomach churned. This case was no longer just about Jake Miller. It was about something much darker, much more dangerous. And he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. The news of Eleanor Grayson's arrest spread like wildfire. By the time Judge Thompson returned to the courtroom, it was packed with reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers. The air was thick with tension, and the judge could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him as he took his seat. "All rise," the bailiff called out, but the usual formality felt hollow. Judge Thompson banged his gavel, silencing the murmurs that had already begun. "This court is back in session," he announced, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced at Jake Miller, who looked even more terrified than before. The young man's eyes darted around the room as if expecting Marcus Blackwell, or someone worse, to appear at any moment. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, stood up. "Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, I move to postpone this trial until we can get to the bottom of what's happening." Judge Thompson nodded. "Agreed. This court is adjourned until further notice." As soon as the gavel fell, the room erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward Jake, shouting questions, but he was quickly whisked away by bailiffs. Judge Thompson retreated to his chambers, his mind racing. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Meanwhile, Eleanor Grayson was being held in a secure federal facility. The agents who had taken her were tight-lipped, refusing to answer any of her questions. But Eleanor wasn't the type to sit quietly. "You can't keep me here without telling me why," she said calmly to the agent guarding her cell. The agent shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just following orders." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "And who gave those orders?" Before the agent could respond, the door opened, and a man in a sharp suit walked in. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a stern expression. Eleanor recognized him immediately. "Agent Daniels," she said, her voice cool. "It's been a long time." Daniels nodded. "Eleanor. I wish I could say it's good to see you." "Cut the small talk," Eleanor replied. "Why am I here?" Daniels sighed and pulled up a chair. "You're here because of Marcus Blackwell. He's back, and he's making moves. We think he's trying to finish what his father started." Eleanor's expression hardened. The Blackwell case had been the defining moment of her career, and the reason she had disappeared. She had taken down the Blackwell crime family, but at a great cost. Marcus Blackwell, the son of the family's leader, had sworn revenge. "What does this have to do with me?" Eleanor asked. "You're the only one who knows how he operates," Daniels said. "We need your help to stop him." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had spent decades trying to leave her past behind, but it seemed the past wasn't done with her. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Daniels's expression darkened. "Then you'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Blackwell has evidence tying you to a crime you didn't commit, but it's convincing enough to put you away for good." Eleanor's jaw tightened. She had always known Marcus was dangerous, but she hadn't realized just how far he was willing to go. "Fine," she said finally. "I'll help you. But on one condition." "What's that?" Daniels asked. "I want to finish what I started with Jake Miller's case," Eleanor said. He's an innocent kid caught up in this mess, and I'm not going to let Blackwell ruin his life. Daniels hesitated, then nodded. We'll see what we can do. Back at the courthouse, Jake Miller was sitting in a small, windowless room, his mind racing. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing: he was in way over his head. The door opened, and a familiar face walked in. It was Eleanor Grayson. Ms. Grayson. Jake exclaimed, jumping to his feet. What's happening? Why were you arrested? Eleanor held up a hand to silence him. Sit down, Jake. We don't have much time. Jake obeyed, his heart pounding. Listen carefully, Eleanor said, her voice low and urgent. You're in danger. Marcus Blackwell is after you, and he's not going to stop until he gets what he wants. What does he want from me? Jake asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor hesitated, then said, he thinks you have something that belongs to him. Something your employer stole. Jake's eyes widened. I don't know anything about that. I swear. I believe you, Eleanor said. But Blackwell doesn't. That's why we need to work together to prove your innocence, and stop him before it's too late. Before Jake could respond, the door burst open, and two men in black suits walked in. They weren't federal agents, Jake could tell that much. Time's up, one of them said, pulling out a gun. Eleanor stood up, shielding Jake with her body. If you want him, you'll have to go through me. The men exchanged a glance, then one of them smirked. Fine by us. As they raised their weapons, Jake's heart stopped. He was sure this was the end. But then, the door flew open again, and a group of federal agents stormed in, guns drawn. Drop your weapons, one of them shouted. The men hesitated, then slowly lowered their guns. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Eleanor turned to him, her expression grim. This is just the beginning, Jake. Stay close to me, and do exactly as I say. If we're going to survive this, we need to trust each other. Jake nodded, though his hands were still shaking. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. The room was a blur of shouting and chaos as federal agents handcuffed the two men in black suits. Jake Miller sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear what was happening around him. Eleanor Grayson stood protectively in front of him, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if expecting more trouble. Are you okay? She asked, turning to Jake. He nodded, though he felt anything but okay. His hands were trembling, and his mind was racing. Who were those guys? What do they want from me? Eleanor hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. They're Blackwell's men. And they're not going to stop until they get what they're after. But I don't have anything. Jake exclaimed, his voice cracking. I don't even know what they're looking for. Eleanor's expression softened. I believe you, Jake. But Marcus Blackwell doesn't. And that's why we need to figure this out, fast. Before Jake could respond, Agent Daniels walked into the room, his face grim. We need to move. Now. Eleanor nodded and helped Jake to his feet. Stay close to me, she said firmly. No matter what happens, don't wander off. Jake followed her out of the room, his legs feeling like jelly. The courthouse was swarming with federal agents, and the tension in the air was palpable. Reporters were shouting questions from behind barricades, but no one stopped to answer them. As they were escorted to a black SUV, Jake couldn't help but feel like he was in a nightmare. Just a few hours ago, he had been sitting in a courtroom, hoping for a chance to clear his name. Now, he was caught in the middle of something far bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The SUV sped through the streets, its sirens blaring. Jake sat in the back seat, sandwiched between Eleanor and Agent Daniels. He wanted to ask questions, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Where are we going? Safe house, Daniels replied curtly. Blackwell's men are everywhere, and we need to keep you two off the grid until we figure out our next move. Jake swallowed hard. How long will that take? Daniels glanced at him, his expression unreadable. As long as it needs to. The safe house turned out to be a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It was surrounded by tall fences and armed guards, and Jake couldn't help but feel like he was walking into a prison. Once inside, Eleanor led Jake to a small room with a couch and a table. Sit down, she said gently. You've had a long day. Jake collapsed onto the couch, his head spinning. Ms. Grayson. I don't understand any of this. Why is Blackwell after me? What does he think I have? Eleanor sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. It's complicated, Jake. But here's what I know, your employer, the company you worked for, was involved in some shady dealings. Blackwell believes they stole something valuable from him, something he's willing to kill for. Jake's eyes widened. But I didn't know anything about that. I was just an intern. I know, Eleanor said. And that's why we need to prove your innocence. But to do that, we need to find out what Blackwell is after. Jake buried his face in his hands. This is insane. I just wanted to start my career. I didn't sign up for this. Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on his arm. I know this is overwhelming, Jake. But you're not alone. I'm going to do everything in my power to protect you. Jake looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Why are you helping me? You don't even know me. Eleanor smiled faintly. Because it's the right thing to do. And because I've been where you are, caught in the crossfire of someone else's war. I won't let Blackwell destroy another life. Before Jake could respond, the door opened, and Agent Daniels walked in. We've got a problem, he said, his voice tense. What now? Eleanor asked, standing up. Blackwell's men just hit one of our other safe houses, Daniels replied. They're getting bolder. And they're getting closer. Eleanor's expression hardened. We need to move Jake somewhere safer. Somewhere Blackwell won't think to look. Daniels nodded. We're working on it. But for now, we need to stay put and keep a low profile. As Daniels left the room, Jake felt a wave of panic wash over him. What if they find us here? He asked, his voice trembling. Eleanor sat back down, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Jake's fear. They won't, she said firmly. Not if we're smart about this. But deep down, even Eleanor wasn't sure. Blackwell was ruthless, and he had resources that even the FBI couldn't match. They were running out of time, and everyone in the room knew it. Later that night, as Jake lay on the couch trying to sleep, he heard a faint noise outside. He sat up, his heart racing. Ms. Grayson, he whispered. Eleanor was already on her feet, her eyes fixed on the window. Stay down, she said quietly, motioning for him to get on the floor. Jake obeyed, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could hear footsteps outside, and the sound of someone trying to pick the lock on the door. Eleanor grabbed a lamp from the table and held it like a weapon, her eyes never leaving the door. The lock clicked, and the door slowly creaked open. The door inched open, and Jake held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure whoever was on the other side could hear it. Eleanor Grayson stood frozen, the lamp raised high in her hands, ready to strike. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint creak of the door hinges. A shadowy figure stepped inside, and Eleanor lunged forward, swinging the lamp with all her might. Whoa, 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 a familiar voice shouted, ducking just in time to avoid the blow. It's me. Eleanor froze, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the man standing in front of her. It was Agent Daniels. Daniels, she hissed, lowering the lamp. What the hell are you doing sneaking in here like that? You nearly gave us a heart attack. Daniels held up his hands in surrender, his face pale. I didn't want to risk drawing attention by knocking. Blackwell's men are swarming the area. We need to move. Now. Jake scrambled to his feet, his legs still shaky. Move? Move where? Somewhere safer, Daniels said, his tone urgent. We've got a car waiting outside. Let's go. Eleanor didn't argue. She grabbed her coat and motioned for Jake to follow. Stay close, she whispered. And don't make a sound. The three of them slipped out of the safe house and into the cold night air. A black sedan was idling nearby, its headlights off. Daniels opened the back door and ushered Jake and Eleanor inside before climbing into the driver's seat. As the car pulled away, Jake glanced out the window and saw shadowy figures moving in the distance. His stomach churned. Are those Blackwell's men? Daniels confirmed, his eyes fixed on the road. They're getting closer. Too close. The car sped through the empty streets, its tires squealing around corners. Jake clutched the door handle, his knuckles white. Where are we going? Another safe house, Daniels replied. One Blackwell doesn't know about. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low. How did they find us, Daniels? These locations are supposed to be secure. Daniels's jaw tightened. I don't know. But I'm starting to think we've got a leak. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. If someone inside the FBI was working with Blackwell, they were in even more danger than he'd thought. The drive felt like it lasted forever, but eventually, the car pulled up to a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place no one would look twice at, perfect for staying under the radar. Daniels parked the car and handed Eleanor a key. Room 12. Stay there until I come for you. Eleanor nodded and led Jake to the room. Inside, it was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. The furniture was old and worn, but it was better than nothing. Jake sat down on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. Ms. Grayson, what happens now? Eleanor sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. Now, we wait. And we plan. Blackwell isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants, so we need to stay one step ahead of him. But how? Jake asked, his voice trembling. He's got an army, and we're just two people. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. We're not alone, Jake. Daniels and the FBI are on our side. And I've been in this game a long time. I know how Blackwell thinks. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. Do you really think we can beat him? Eleanor's gaze hardened. We don't have a choice. The hours dragged by, and Jake found it impossible to sleep. Every sound outside made him jump, and his mind kept replaying the events of the past few days. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, there was a knock at the door. Eleanor was on her feet instantly, her hand reaching for the lamp again. Who is it? She called out. It's me, Danielle's voice replied. Open up. Eleanor unlocked the door and let him in. He looked exhausted, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot. What's going on? Eleanor asked, her voice tense. Daniels hesitated, then said, We've got a lead. Blackwell's men are planning something big. Something that could blow this whole case wide open. What kind of something? Jake asked, his heart racing. Daniels looked at him, his expression grim. They're planning to break into your old office tonight. They think whatever they're looking for is still there. Jake's stomach dropped. But I don't know what they're after. I swear. I believe you, Daniels said. But Blackwell doesn't. And if we can catch his men in the act, we might be able to turn the tables on him. Eleanor crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. What's the plan? Daniels took a deep breath. We set a trap. We let them think they're walking into an easy score, and then we take them down. Jake's heart pounded. And what about me? What do I do? Daniels looked at him, his expression softening. You stay here, where it's safe. This isn't your fight, Jake. But Jake shook his head. No. I'm tired of hiding. I want to help. Eleanor and Daniels exchanged a glance, then Eleanor nodded. All right. But you do exactly as we say. No heroics. Jake nodded, though his hands were still shaking. As the three of them began to plan, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Blackwell was always one step ahead, and this time, he had the upper hand. But there was no turning back now. The motel room felt like a war room. Maps, photos, and notes were spread out across the small table as Eleanor, Daniels, and Jake huddled together, planning their next move. The air was thick with tension, and every word felt heavy with consequence. Blackwell's men will be at the office by midnight, Daniels said, pointing to a map of the city. We'll have agents stationed here, here, and here. When they move in, we'll close the net. Jake stared at the map, his stomach churning. The office building where he used to work was marked with a red X, and it felt like a target was painted on his chest. What if they realize it's a trap? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They won't, Daniels replied confidently. We've made sure the building looks vulnerable. Blackwell's men will think it's an easy score. Eleanor leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the map. And what about us? Where do we fit into this? You'll be here, Daniels said, pointing to a spot a few blocks away. Close enough to monitor the situation but far enough to stay out of harm's way. Jake frowned. I thought you said I could help. You are helping, Daniels said firmly. By staying safe. Blackwell's men are dangerous, and I'm not risking your life. Jake wanted to argue, but the look in Danielle's eyes stopped him. He nodded reluctantly, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being sidelined. As the sun began to set, the three of them left the motel and drove to their designated location, a small, abandoned warehouse with a clear view of the office building. Inside, a team of FBI agents was already setting up surveillance equipment. This is it, Daniels said, handing Eleanor a pair of binoculars. Keep an eye on the building and let us know if you see anything suspicious. Eleanor nodded and took the binoculars, her expression focused. Jake sat down on a nearby crate, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He felt useless, like a bystander in his own life. Hours passed, and the tension in the room grew thicker with every minute. The agents communicated in hushed tones, their eyes glued to the monitors. Jake tried to stay calm, but his mind kept racing. What if Blackwell's men didn't show up? What if they did, and something went wrong? Finally, just after midnight, one of the agents spoke up. We've got movement. 2 vehicles approaching the building. Daniels grabbed a radio. All units, stand by. Let them get inside before we move. Jake's heart pounded as he watched the monitors. 2 black SUVs pulled up to the office building, and a group of men in dark clothing stepped out. They moved quickly and efficiently, breaking into the building with ease. They're in, the agent said, his voice tense. Daniels nodded. Give them 5 minutes, then move in. The wait felt like an eternity. Jake clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to do something, anything, but he knew he had to stay put. Suddenly, Eleanor stiffened. Wait, she said, her voice sharp. Something's not right. Daniels turned to her. What do you mean? Eleanor pointed to one of the monitors. Look at their movements. They're not searching for something. They're setting up. Danielle's eyes widened as he realized what she meant. It's a trap. They're luring us in. Before anyone could react, the monitors went dark. The agents scrambled to restore the feed, but it was too late. We've lost visual, one of them shouted. Daniels grabbed his radio. All units, abort. I repeat, abort. It's a trap. But it was too late. A loud explosion rocked the night, and the office building erupted in flames. The shockwave rattled the windows of the warehouse, and Jake stumbled backward, his ears ringing. "No!" Daniels shouted, his face pale. "They knew we were coming." Eleanor grabbed Jake's arm, her grip tight. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake didn't argue. He followed her out of the warehouse, his heart pounding. The streets were chaos, sirens blared, and people screamed as the fire raged in the distance. As they ran, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. It was Marcus Blackwell. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with Marcus Blackwell. The man stood calmly in the shadows, his hands in his pockets, as if the chaos around him was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. His expression was unreadable, but his presence sent a chill down Jake's spine. "Ms. Grayson," Jake whispered, tugging on Eleanor's sleeve. "It's him. It's Blackwell." Eleanor froze and followed Jake's gaze. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted Blackwell, and for a moment, it seemed like she might confront him. But then she grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him into a nearby alley. "We need to move," she said urgently. "Now." Jake didn't argue. They sprinted through the narrow alley, the sounds of sirens and shouting growing fainter behind them. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, and his legs burned with every step, but he didn't dare slow down. Finally, they emerged onto a quieter street, and Eleanor pulled Jake into the shadow of a building. She peered around the corner, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of Blackwell or his men. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice low. "Blackwell knows we're onto him, and he's not going to stop until he finds us." Jake leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "What do we do now? The FBI's operation just blew up, literally. We can't trust anyone." Eleanor's expression was grim. "We go off the grid. No more safe houses, no more agents. It's just you and me now." Jake swallowed hard. The thought of being completely alone with Eleanor was both comforting and terrifying. She was clearly capable, but Blackwell was always one step ahead. "Where do we start?" Jake asked. Eleanor hesitated, then said, "We start with your old office. Blackwell's men were there for a reason. If we can figure out what they were after, we might be able to turn the tables on him." Jake's eyes widened. "But the building just exploded. It's probably crawling with cops and firefighters." "Exactly," Eleanor said with a faint smile. "No one will expect us to go back there. And if Blackwell's men left anything behind, we need to find it before they do." Jake nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of returning to the scene of the explosion. "All right. Let's do it." They moved quickly and quietly through the streets, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. The closer they got to the office building, the thicker the smoke and chaos became. Fire trucks and police cars were everywhere, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Eleanor led Jake to a side entrance that was partially hidden by debris. The door was slightly ajar, and she slipped inside, motioning for Jake to follow. The interior of the building was dark and filled with smoke. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and chemicals, and Jake had to cover his mouth to keep from coughing. "Stay close," Eleanor whispered, pulling a small flashlight from her pocket. They moved through the building, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The explosion had caused significant damage, and the walls were blackened and crumbling. Jake's heart raced as they approached what used to be his office. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the room inside was a mess of shattered glass and broken furniture. Eleanor stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. "What are we looking for?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Anything that doesn't belong," Eleanor replied. "Blackwell's men were here for a reason. They wouldn't have risked coming back unless they thought something important was still here." Jake nodded and began searching through the debris. His hands trembled as he sifted through the wreckage, but he forced himself to focus. After a few minutes, Eleanor let out a sharp breath. "Jake. Over here." He hurried to her side and saw her holding a small, charred USB drive. It was partially melted, but it was still intact. "This could be it," Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming. If Blackwell's men were after this, it must contain something valuable. Jake's heart raced. "What do we do with it?" Before Eleanor could answer, a voice echoed through the hallway. "I'll take that." They turned to see Marcus Blackwell standing in the doorway, a gun in his hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "You've caused me a lot of trouble," Blackwell said, stepping into the room. "But it ends here." Jake's stomach dropped, and he instinctively stepped closer to Eleanor. Eleanor held up the USB drive, her voice steady. "If you want it, you'll have to go through me." Blackwell smirked. "Gladly." He raised his gun, and Jake's heart stopped. But before Blackwell could pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the building. The ceiling above them groaned, and a section of it collapsed, sending debris raining down. "Move!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him out of the way. The room filled with dust and smoke, and Jake coughed as he stumbled to his feet. He could barely see through the haze, but he could hear Blackwell cursing somewhere nearby. "This way," Eleanor said, dragging Jake toward a broken window. They climbed through the window and dropped onto the fire escape outside. The metal stairs groaned under their weight, but they didn't stop. They descended as quickly as they could, their footsteps echoing in the night. When they reached the ground, Eleanor pulled Jake into the shadows. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jake nodded, his heart still racing. But as they turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the darkness, blocking their path. It was Agent Daniels. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he saw Agent Daniels standing in front of them. The man looked disheveled, his suit torn and his face smeared with soot. His eyes were wide, and he was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running. "Daniels," Eleanor said, her voice a mix of relief and suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Daniels held up a hand, signaling for them to stay quiet. "No time to explain. We need to move. Blackwell's men are everywhere." Jake glanced at Eleanor, unsure whether to trust him. After everything that had happened, he didn't know who was on their side anymore. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "How did you find us?" "I tracked your movements," Daniels said quickly. "I knew you'd come back here. Now, let's go before it's too late." Eleanor exchanged a look with Jake, then nodded. "All right. Lead the way." Daniels turned and motioned for them to follow. They moved quickly through the dark streets, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. Was Daniels really here to help them? Or was this another trap? After a few minutes, they reached a parked car. Daniels opened the back door and gestured for Jake and Eleanor to get in. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "Somewhere safe," Daniels replied. "Somewhere Blackwell won't find us." Jake climbed into the car, his heart pounding. Eleanor followed, her hand gripping the USB drive tightly. Daniels got into the driver's seat and started the engine, pulling away from the curb with a screech of tires. As they drove, Jake glanced out the window, watching the city blur past. The streets were eerily quiet, and the tension in the car was suffocating. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "Daniels, what happened back there? How did Blackwell know about the operation?" Daniels's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't know. But I have a feeling someone tipped him off." Jake's stomach churned. "You mean, someone in the FBI?" Daniels didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low. "If there's a mole, we need to find out who it is. Otherwise, we're all in danger." Daniels nodded. I'm working on it. But for now, we need to focus on staying alive. The car fell silent again, and Jake leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Blackwell's men were closing in on them. After what felt like hours, the car pulled up to a small, secluded cabin in the woods. The area was dark and quiet, with only the sound of crickets breaking the silence. "This is it," Daniels said, turning off the engine. "We'll be safe here for now." Jake climbed out of the car, his legs still shaky. The cabin looked old and run down, but it was better than nothing. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished, with a small kitchen, a table, and a couple of chairs. Daniels locked the door behind them and pulled the curtains closed. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said. "We'll stay here until we figure out our next move." Jake sat down at the table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Eleanor sat across from him, her expression thoughtful. "What's on the USB drive?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. Eleanor pulled it out of her pocket and held it up. "I don't know. But if Blackwell's men were willing to risk everything to get it, it must be important." Daniels walked over and took the USB drive from her. "Let's find out." He pulled a laptop out of a bag and plugged the USB drive into it. The screen flickered to life, and a series of files appeared. Jake leaned forward, his heart racing. "What is it?" Daniels clicked on one of the files, and his eyes widened. This is a list of names. And transactions. It looks like evidence of money laundering." Eleanor's expression hardened. Blackwell's money laundering. This could be the key to taking him down. Jake's stomach churned. "But why was it in my office? I didn't even know about this." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. "You were set up, Jake. Someone planted this in your office to frame you." Jake's heart sank. "Who would do that?" Before anyone could answer, there was a loud crash outside. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the cabin, and the lights flickered before going out completely. "Get down!" Daniels shouted, pulling out his gun. Jake dropped to the floor, his heart pounding. He could hear footsteps outside, and the sound of voices shouting. "We're surrounded," Daniels said, his voice tense. "Blackwell's men found us." Eleanor grabbed Jake's arm, her grip tight. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't let go." Jake nodded, though his hands were trembling. He could hear the sound of gunfire outside, and the walls of the cabin shook with the impact. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a group of armed men stormed in. "Hands up," one of them shouted, his gun trained on Daniels. Daniels raised his hands, his expression grim. "Don't shoot. We're unarmed." The men moved quickly, grabbing Jake and Eleanor and pulling them to their feet. Jake's heart raced as he was dragged outside, the cold night air hitting his face. Blackwell was waiting for them, his arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "You really thought you could outsmart me?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Jake's stomach dropped. They were out of options, out of time. But then, Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You're not as clever as you think, Blackwell," she said, her voice steady. "And you're not going to win." Blackwell's smirk faded, replaced by a look of anger. "We'll see about that." As the men began to drag them away, Jake's mind raced. They were in deeper than ever, and he had no idea how they were going to get out of this. But one thing was clear, the fight wasn't over yet. The cold night air bit at Jake's skin as Blackwell's men shoved him and Eleanor into the back of a black van. The interior was dark and smelled of oil and metal. Jake's hands were bound with zip ties, and his heart pounded so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Across from him, Eleanor sat calmly, her eyes scanning the van as if calculating their next move. Blackwell climbed into the passenger seat, his smirk returning as he glanced back at them. "You two have caused me a lot of trouble," he said, his voice cold. "But don't worry. It's over now. Jake's stomach churned. What are you going to do with us? Blackwell's smirk widened. You'll see. The van started moving, and Jake felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He glanced at Eleanor, hoping she had a plan, but her expression was unreadable. After what felt like hours, the van came to a stop. The doors swung open, and Blackwell's men dragged Jake and Eleanor out. They were in the middle of nowhere, a desolate industrial area surrounded by abandoned warehouses. The only light came from a single flickering street lamp, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Blackwell led the way, his men following close behind with Jake and Eleanor in tow. They entered one of the warehouses, its interior dark and filled with the smell of rust and decay. "Welcome to your new home," Blackwell said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "At least, for the time being." Jake's eyes darted around the warehouse, searching for a way out. But the place was a maze of rusted machinery and broken crates, and the exits were blocked by Blackwell's men. Eleanor, however, seemed unfazed. She turned to Blackwell, her voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. This isn't going to end the way you think." Blackwell laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're in no position to threaten me, Eleanor. You're out of moves." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Am I?" Before Blackwell could respond, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and the lights flickered on, illuminating the space in a harsh, fluorescent glow. "What the f-" Blackwell started, but his words were cut off by the sound of shouting. Jake turned to see a group of armed men storming into the warehouse. But these weren't Blackwell's men, they were wearing tactical gear, and their faces were covered with masks. "FBI! Freeze!" one of them shouted, his gun trained on Blackwell. Blackwell's men scrambled to react, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The warehouse erupted into chaos as gunfire rang out, and Jake dropped to the floor, covering his head with his hands. "Jake!" Eleanor shouted, grabbing his arm. "This way." She pulled him to his feet and dragged him behind a stack of crates, shielding them from the gunfire. Jake's heart raced as he crouched beside her, his hands still bound. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Back up," Eleanor said, a faint smile on her lips. "I called it in before we left the cabin." Jake's eyes widened. "How?" Eleanor held up a small device, a hidden panic button. "Always be prepared." The gunfire continued, but it was clear that Blackwell's men were losing. One by one, they were either subdued or forced to retreat. Blackwell himself was cornered, his hands raised in surrender as the FBI agents closed in. "It's over, Blackwell," one of the agents said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest." Blackwell's smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "You hear me? This isn't over." As the agents cuffed him and led him away, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. It was finally over. But Eleanor's expression was still serious. She turned to Jake and said, "We're not out of the woods yet. Blackwell's network is vast, and there's still a mole in the FBI. We need to be careful." Jake nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "What do we do now?" Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now, we finish what we started. We take down Blackwell's empire, for good." As they were escorted out of the warehouse by the FBI, Jake couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had survived Blackwell's trap, but the fight was far from over. And as long as Eleanor was by his side, he knew they had a chance. The warehouse was a blur of flashing lights and shouting voices as FBI agents secured the scene. Jake stood off to the side, his hands finally free from the zip ties, watching as Blackwell was shoved into the back of a police car. The man's face was twisted with anger, but he didn't resist. He simply glared at Jake and Eleanor as the door slammed shut. "It's not over," Blackwell mouthed through the window, his eyes burning with hatred. Jake shivered and looked away. He didn't want to think about what Blackwell might do next. Eleanor walked over to him, her expression calm but focused. You okay? She asked. Jake nodded, though his legs still felt like jelly. Yeah. Just, shaken up, I guess. Eleanor gave him a small smile. You did good, Jake. Not many people could have handled what you just went through. Jake managed a weak smile in return. Thanks. But I couldn't have done it without you. Before Eleanor could respond, Agent Daniels approached them, his face grim. We need to talk, he said, motioning for them to follow him. They walked to a quieter area of the warehouse, away from the chaos. Daniels crossed his arms and looked at Eleanor. You called in backup. How? Eleanor held up the panic button again. I've been in this game a long time, Daniels. I don't take chances. Daniels nodded, though his expression was still serious. Blackwell's in custody, but this isn't over. His network is still out there, and we still don't know who the mole is. Jake's stomach churned. What do we do now? Daniels sighed. We need to move fast. Blackwell's men will scatter without him, but they're still dangerous. And if the mole is still active, they'll know everything we're planning. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. We need to use Blackwell's arrest to our advantage. If we can get him to talk, we might be able to dismantle his entire operation. Daniels shook his head. Blackwell's not going to talk. He's too smart for that. Eleanor smirked. Everyone has a weakness. We just need to find his. Jake looked between them, feeling out of his depth. What can I do to help? Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. You've done enough, Jake. For now, you need to stay safe. Blackwell's men will be looking for you. Jake frowned. But I can't just sit around while you two do all the work. Daniels stepped forward. You won't be sitting around. We're going to put you in protective custody until this is over. It's the safest option. Jake wanted to argue, but he knew they were right. He wasn't a trained agent or a seasoned attorney. He was just a kid caught in the middle of something way bigger than himself. All right, he said reluctantly. But promise me you'll keep me in the loop. Eleanor nodded. You have my word. As Daniels led Jake to a waiting car, Eleanor stayed behind, her mind racing. Blackwell's arrest was a victory, but it was only the beginning. She needed to figure out who the mole was and fast. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. It's me, Eleanor said. I need your help. The voice on the other end chuckled. Eleanor Grayson, calling in a favor. I never thought I'd see the day. Eleanor smirked. Cut the jokes, Sam. This is serious. Sam's tone turned serious. What do you need? I need you to dig into the FBI, Eleanor said. There's a mole, and I need to find out who it is. There was a pause on the other end. That's a tall order, even for me. But I'll see what I can do. Thanks, Sam, Eleanor said. I owe you one. She hung up and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Sam was one of the best hackers she knew, and if anyone could uncover the mole, it was him. As she walked back to the car, her mind was already racing with plans. Blackwell's empire was crumbling, but the fight wasn't over yet. And she wasn't going to stop until every last piece of it was destroyed. The safe house was a nondescript apartment in a quiet part of the city. Jake sat on the couch, staring at the TV without really watching it. The news was filled with reports of Blackwell's arrest, but Jake couldn't focus. His mind was racing, replaying everything that had happened over the past few days. Eleanor had left hours ago, promising to return as soon as she had more information. Jake trusted her, but the waiting was unbearable. He felt useless, like a sitting duck. The sound of a key turning in the lock made him jump. He turned to see Eleanor walking in, her face grim. What's going on? Jake asked, standing up. Eleanor closed the door behind her and set a bag of groceries on the table. "We've got a problem," she said. Jake's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" Eleanor sighed and sat down. "Sam found something. There's a mole in the FBI, just like we thought. But it's worse than we imagined." Jake sat down across from her, his heart pounding. "Who is it?" Eleanor hesitated, then said, "It's someone high up. Someone with access to everything." That's how Blackwell always seemed to be one step ahead. Jake's mind raced. "Do you know who it is?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. But Sam's working on it. In the meantime, we need to be careful. If the mole finds out we're onto them, they'll come after us." Jake swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We keep digging. Blackwell's in custody, but his network is still active. If we can find the mole, we can take them all down." Jake nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "How can I help?" Eleanor gave him a small smile. "You've already helped more than you know, Jake. But for now, you need to stay here and stay safe. I'll handle the rest." Jake wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He wasn't a trained agent or a seasoned attorney. He was just a kid caught in the middle of something way bigger than himself. As Eleanor stood to leave, Jake called after her. "Eleanor?" She turned to look at him. "Yeah." "Be careful," he said, his voice trembling. Eleanor nodded. "Always." After she left, Jake sat back down on the couch, his mind racing. He felt helpless, like a pawn in a game he didn't understand. But he knew one thing, he wasn't going to sit around and do nothing. He pulled out his phone and started searching for information on Blackwell's network. If Eleanor was going to take them down, he was going to do everything he could to help. Meanwhile, Eleanor was meeting with Sam in a dimly lit cafe on the other side of the city. Sam was a wiry man in his 30s with a laptop that never left his side. He slid a USB drive across the table to Eleanor. "This is everything I could find," he said. "But be careful. If the mole finds out you have this, they'll come after you." Eleanor nodded and pocketed the drive. "Thanks, Sam. I owe you one." Sam smirked. "You owe me more than one. But we'll settle up later." As Eleanor left the cafe, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, she quickened her pace, her hand gripping the USB drive tightly. Back at the safe house, Jake was deep in his research when he heard a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. Eleanor wouldn't knock, she had a key. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing outside was a man in a suit, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. "Who is it?" Jake called, his voice trembling. The man looked up, and Jake's blood ran cold. It was Agent Daniels. Jake's heart pounded as he stared through the peephole at Agent Daniels. The man looked calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Jake's stomach churn. "Jake, open the door," Daniels said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." Jake hesitated. Eleanor had told him not to trust anyone, and Daniels showing up unannounced felt wrong. But what if he was here to help? I can't," Jake stammered. Eleanor said not to let anyone in. Daniels sighed, his expression softening. "Jake, I know you're scared. But I'm here to protect you. Blackwell's men are closing in, and we need to move you to a safer location." Jake's mind raced. He wanted to believe Daniels, but something felt off. "Why didn't you call first?" "There's no time," Daniels said, his voice urgent. "Please, Jake. Trust me." Jake bit his lip, torn between fear and hope. Finally, he unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. "Where's Eleanor?" Daniels stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "She's safe. But we need to move quickly." grab your things. Jake nodded and turned to gather his belongings. As he did, he noticed Daniels glancing around the apartment, his eyes lingering on the laptop Jake had been using. "What's that?" Daniels asked, pointing to the laptop. "Just some research," Jake said, his voice shaky. Daniels walked over and picked up the laptop, his expression darkening as he saw the screen. "Jake, what are you doing?" Jake's heart raced. "I was just trying to help. I thought if I could find something on Blackwell's network." "This is dangerous," Daniels interrupted, his voice sharp. "You could have led them right to you." Jake's stomach dropped. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, the door burst open, and two men in black suits stormed in, guns drawn. "Freeze," one of them shouted, his weapon trained on Daniels. Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding. "What's going on?" Daniels raised his hands, his face pale. "Jake, run." But it was too late. One of the men grabbed Jake and shoved him against the wall, while the other disarmed Daniels and forced him to the ground. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, Daniels," the man said, his voice cold. Jake's mind raced as he realized the truth. Daniels wasn't here to protect him. He was the mole. The man holding Jake leaned in close, his breath hot on Jake's ear. "Blackwell sends his regards." Jake's stomach churned as he struggled against the man's grip. "Let me go." Before the man could respond, the window shattered, and a flashbang grenade rolled into the room. The explosion of light and sound disoriented everyone, and Jake dropped to the floor, covering his ears. When the dust settled, Jake looked up to see Eleanor standing in the doorway, a gun in her hand. "Get away from him," she said, her voice cold and steady. The men hesitated, but one of them lunged at her. Eleanor fired, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. The other man released Jake and raised his hands in surrender. Daniels, still on the floor, glared at Eleanor. "You're too late, Grayson. Blackwell's already won." Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Blackwell's in custody, Daniels. And you're next." Daniels smirked, but there was fear in his eyes. "You think this changes anything? His network is everywhere. You'll never stop them." Eleanor knelt down, her face inches from his. "Watch me." As she cuffed Daniels and called for backup, Jake sat on the floor, his hands trembling. He felt like he'd just survived a nightmare. Eleanor walked over and knelt beside him. "You okay?" Jake nodded, though his voice was shaky. I thought he was here to help." Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. But you did good, Jake. You trusted your instincts, and that's what kept you alive." Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "What happens now?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "Now, we finish what we started. Blackwell's empire is crumbling, and with Daniels in custody, we'll have everything we need to take it down for good." As the sound of sirens grew closer, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they had a chance. And as long as Eleanor was by his side, he knew they could win. The safe house was now a hive of activity as FBI agents swarmed the apartment, securing the scene and processing evidence. Daniels was led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of defiance as he shot one last glare at Eleanor and Jake. The two men who had stormed the apartment were also taken into custody, their weapons confiscated and their identities being verified. Jake sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, as paramedics checked him for injuries. His hands were still trembling, but the worst of the shock was starting to wear off. Eleanor stood nearby, speaking quietly with Agent Daniels' replacement, a stern woman named Agent Ramirez. "We've got everything we need to bring down Blackwell's network," Ramirez said, holding up the USB drive Eleanor had retrieved from Sam. "This is a goldmine of information, names, transactions, everything. With Daniels in custody, we can start dismantling the operation from the inside." Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. Good. But we need to move fast. Blackwell's men will scatter if they think we're closing in. Ramirez agreed. We're already coordinating raids on several locations. By morning, we'll have most of his key players in custody. Jake listened to the conversation, his mind racing. It was hard to believe that after everything they'd been through, they were finally on the verge of taking down Blackwell's empire. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. Eleanor, he called softly, catching her attention. She walked over and sat down beside him. What's on your mind, Jake? Jake hesitated, then said, what if there's more to this? What if Daniels wasn't the only mole? Eleanor's expression softened. It's possible. But we've got the upper hand now. With the information on this USB drive, we can expose everyone involved. Jake nodded, though he still felt uneasy. I don't want to let my guard down yet. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. That's smart. But you don't have to carry this alone anymore, Jake. You've done more than anyone could have asked of you. Jake managed a small smile. Thanks, Eleanor. I couldn't have made it through this without you. Eleanor smiled back. We make a good team. As the night wore on, the FBI's operation moved into high gear. Raids were conducted across the city, and one by one, Blackwell's key operatives were arrested. The news was filled with reports of the takedown, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt a sense of relief. But the fight wasn't over yet. The next morning, Eleanor and Jake met with Agent Ramirez at FBI headquarters to review the progress of the operation. We've arrested over 24 people connected to Blackwell's network, Ramirez said, pointing to a map covered in red pins. And we've seized millions in assets. This is a major blow to organized crime in the city. Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the map. What about Blackwell? Has he said anything? Ramirez shook her head. He's not talking. But with the evidence we have, he won't be able to weasel his way out of this. Jake felt a surge of hope. So, it's really over. Ramirez smiled. It's over, Jake. You're safe now. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was finally over. As they left the FBI headquarters, Jake turned to Eleanor. What happens now? Eleanor looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Now, you get to live your life. Go back to school, start your career. Put all of this behind you. Jake frowned. What about you? Eleanor smiled faintly. I'll keep doing what I do. There's always another fight, another case. But for now, I think I'll take a break. Jake nodded, though he felt a pang of sadness. He had grown to admire Eleanor, and the thought of not seeing her again was hard to swallow. Thank you, he said, his voice sincere. For everything. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. You're welcome, Jake. And remember, you're stronger than you think. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. As they parted ways, Jake felt a sense of closure. The nightmare was over, and he could finally start rebuilding his life. But as he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the woman who had fought by his side. Eleanor Grayson wasn't just a legendary attorney, she was a hero. And Jake knew he would never forget her.